I remember the lodge mostly by its quiet, the kind of quiet that settles around a room when people believe they're safe from being truly seen. It sat just outside Asheville, tucked between pine and fading dusk, a place that should have belonged to gentler memories. The cedar walls breathed out a faint warmth, and candlelight bent itself across the grain as if trying to soften whatever the night was about to reveal. They brought out plates of roasted trout, cornbread brushed with honey butter, and small bowls of mountain greens. The servers moved with the kind of ceremony meant for celebration, not knowing that some gatherings are already breaking when they begin. Ethan stood at the center of it all, 32 years old, polished from the life he'd built in Charlotte, dressed in the quiet confidence of a man who believes admiration is his birthright. He lifted his glass, grinning at his friends, a grin he once saved for me alone when he was a boy showing me his first woodworking project. Then he said it. He introduced me as just a poor relative who tags along for free food, letting the joke roll across the table like a stone skipping across still water. His friends laughed. Easy, automatic, careless laughter. They didn't know me, not really. To them, I was just another older man at the far end of the table, someone who belonged to a forgotten chapter of Ethan's life. But he knew. He knew exactly what he was doing. The moment hung in the air longer than it should have. I kept my back straight, my hands resting lightly against the linen tablecloth. The words didn't strike like a blow. They settled instead, softly, like dust on polished wood, quiet, unmistakable, impossible to brush away without leaving a trace. Natalie rolled her eyes, the kind of gesture meant to seem harmless. But it wasn't harmless. It was agreement, approval. A small nod to the image Ethan had been shaping of me for years now. An image that didn't match the man who raised him, guided him, protected him, and rarely asked for anything in return. A violinist played near the fireplace, a slow Appalachian melody, oblivious to the shift in the room. Everyone else continued eating. I looked down at my untouched plate, the candle beside me flickering in a way that made the trout's skin shimmer as though it were breathing. Something in me tightened. Not anger, not humiliation, but recognition. A kind of quiet clarity that arrives only when the truth has been ignored for too long. What broke that night wasn't my pride. It was an illusion. Ethan's laugh echoed again, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching him, not the man he wanted the room to see, but the man he had become when he believed I had nothing left to offer, nothing left to teach, nothing left worth respecting. And in that dim lodge, beneath soft candlelight and the scent of cedar, I realized something had shifted between us. Something that would not shift back. In the weeks after that dinner, I found myself replaying Ethan's joke. Not because of the words, but because of the ease with which he said them. It was the kind of ease that suggested long practice, as though I had become a character he performed for others. A prop, an inherited artifact. Something he could hold up to the light whenever he needed a contrast to make his own success shine brighter. But the truth was, the distance between us hadn't begun in that lodge. It had been widening quietly, almost politely, long before candlelight exposed its shape. When Ethan moved to Charlotte, he stepped into a world that rewarded presentation more than principle. His colleagues carried themselves with an energy that came from knowing the city admired them. Sleek cars gliding into private garages, rooftop gatherings with crafted cocktails, conversations that sounded rehearsed for the sake of being overheard. Everything about his new life felt curated, polished to the point of fragility. I visited a few times in those early years. He'd greet me with quick hugs, always watching the clock. His apartment was modern, cold grays, steel lines, furniture that looked borrowed from a showroom. There were no family photos on the shelves, just framed certificates and mementos from corporate retreats. When he did come home to Asheville, it was never for long. He arrived with the faint impatience of a man fulfilling an obligation. His shoes were expensive, his watch heavier than it needed to be, and his smile carried a distance I couldn't quite name. He spoke of promotions, networking dinners, and aligning himself with the right circles. Each time he talked about that world, something in him tightened, ambition wrapping itself around his identity like a new skin. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I felt myself being moved to the margins. Family gatherings softened into quick visits. Sunday calls became monthly texts. Holidays were reduced to polite excuses about schedules and deadlines. When he did speak to me, his tone shifted, gentle enough to seem respectful, but with an undercurrent of dismissal, as if he were speaking to someone whose relevance had quietly expired. More than once, I caught him glancing at my old pickup parked in his driveway, the way a man looks at something he wishes wouldn't be seen by his neighbors. He never said anything aloud. He didn't need to. Natalie, for her part, had mastered the art of politeness without welcome. She greeted me with smiles that held no warmth, thanked me for gifts she barely glanced at, and always seemed to position herself between Ethan and the parts of his past she found inconvenient. Over time, her presence became a curtain, thin, but effective, shielding Ethan from anything that reminded him of who he had been before the world applauded him. I told myself he was simply growing into his life, that ambition sometimes narrows the field of vision. But beneath the rationalizations, there was a steady ache, the slow understanding that I had been quietly replaced by something shinier, more aligned with the identity he worked so hard to construct. And yet, even as I sensed myself slipping out of his orbit, I held onto the belief that the distance was temporary, that he would look back one day and recognize the foundation that had carried him, that he would remember the nights I stayed up helping him finish school projects, the weekends spent teaching him to drive on quiet mountain roads, the quiet sacrifices that required no applause. But the truth settled in over time, steady and unannounced. He wasn't forgetting me. He was outgrowing the version of me he needed to leave behind. The isolation didn't arrive in a single moment. It arrived in small, unremarkable pieces. Missed calls, clipped conversations, the subtle discomfort in his eyes when he introduced me to his colleagues. And as the months turned into years, I learned how loneliness can grow in a room filled with people, how silence develops even when words are spoken. I felt it most, I think, the day I realized that Ethan no longer asked for my advice. Not about work, not about life, not about anything. It wasn't that he no longer needed guidance. It was that he no longer believed I could offer it. And that, more than the birthday insult, was what truly broke something inside me. I used to believe disrespect announced itself like a slammed door or a raised voice, something loud enough to stop a room and make everyone turn their heads. But I've learned that the real injuries come far more quietly. They arrive as softened requests, disguised expectations, and the subtle reshaping of how a person sees you when they think you're no longer required in their life. What happened between Ethan and me in the weeks before his birthday didn't erupt. It settled. It settled so gradually that by the time I recognized it as a violation, the damage had already made itself comfortable. 2 weeks before the dinner, Ethan called me with a stiffness I recognized immediately. It was the same tone he used when he wanted to appear gracious while giving instructions that weren't meant to be questioned. I was sitting at the kitchen table with an open ledger in front of me, finishing a quiet evening's work. Linda had already gone to bed. The house was still, the kind of stillness that makes a man hear the truth behind anything spoken into it. He told me he had reserved a countryside restaurant, something elegant but rustic. He described the space with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard from him in years. The handcrafted beams, the wine menu, the exposed stone near the hearth. He said it like a man rehearsing a lifestyle he wanted others to believe he naturally inhabited. Then he hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but enough for me to sense the coming shift. He cleared his throat and asked if I could keep things modest that night. At first I thought he meant attire, that I should dress plainly, or not wear the older blazer Linda insisted still looked dignified on me. But he clarified before I could misunderstand. He didn't want me talking about my work or my involvement in the shop, as he still called it. He asked that I avoid discussing finances, business, or anything that might come up if people asked what I did. He said his colleagues were successful, polished, from a different world, and he didn't want them to feel uncomfortable around rural relatives who don't know corporate culture. He said it with an easy breath, maybe believing the words would glide over me without consequence. But the truth hung in the pause that followed. He wanted me small. Not because I was embarrassing, but because the image he had crafted of himself left no room for the truth of where he came from. He needed me edited, softened, muted. I remember staring at the grain of the table beneath my hand, the quiet kitchen light reflecting faintly off a spoon near the teapot. I didn't argue. Men of my generation rarely argue about dignity. We simply absorb the blow, as if we've learned that acknowledging the wound makes it worse. I told him I understood, though I didn't. Not then, not fully. I only understood that something was shifting into place that I had hoped would never take root. The night of the dinner, I arrived early, as I always did. I've never liked the feeling of walking into a room already flowing with conversation. The restaurant was warm, cedar-scented, the kind of place that tried to feel like an embrace. But even then, as I took my seat, the air felt thinner than it should have, as though my presence occupied more weight than Ethan wanted it to. His friends greeted me politely, but with a kind of curated politeness, the kind you reserve for someone you've been told requires gentle handling. They asked small questions about my drive, the weather, the quiet life in Asheville. Questions that ended before they could reveal anything about me beyond what Ethan had already allowed them to know. I could feel the invisible boundaries around their curiosity, as if they were hesitant to violate the version of me he had offered them. I realized then that he had prepared them for a caricature. Someone simple, modest, grateful for the invitation. A man who tagged along for free food. A man who needed watching. And in the quiet between their questions, I felt a tightening in my chest that had little to do with embarrassment. It wasn't hurt pride. Pride, after all, has never been the foundation of my life. It was something deeper, the awareness that my own son had rewritten me in order to fit the story he told about himself. The violation became undeniable when dessert arrived. Candles flickered across the walls, casting shadows that swayed with the violinist's melody. Ethan tapped his glass, preparing to speak. I watched him, not with anticipation, but with the steady clarity of a man who has already been told where he stands. He thanked everyone for coming, lifted his glass, and made the joke about supporting family members who never made it big. A sharper version of the earlier insult, dressed in laughter, presented to the table as entertainment. A second dismissal. Public one. Some laughed because they thought they were supposed to. Others looked down at their plates. Natalie's smirk was thin, a quick twist of the mouth she didn't bother hiding. And through it all, Ethan stood there with the casual confidence of someone who believed the story he was telling was harmless. That reducing me made him appear larger. What lodged itself into me then was the realization that this wasn't immaturity, and it wasn't thoughtlessness. It was deliberate, a curated image. A need to position himself higher by shaping me lower, not in private but in front of those whose approval mattered to him far more than mine. I excused myself after dessert, stepping outside into the cold mountain air. The night pressed against me with an honesty the room had refused to offer. I stood there beneath the dim glow of the porch lantern, breathing slowly, letting the cold settle into me. I knew then that whatever hope I'd been carrying, that Ethan would eventually turn back toward me, recognize the foundation I had laid for him, or reclaim some part of what we once were, had been misplaced. For the first time, I didn't wonder whether Ethan respected me. I understood that he didn't need to anymore. Not in the life he had built, not in the world he wanted to belong to. And that truth, cold and heavy, was the first violation I could not excuse. Experience teaches a man that the most decisive shifts in life rarely arrive with noise. They come quietly, like a small change in temperature, or a faint tightening in the air. That was how it happened for me in the weeks before Ethan's birthday. No drama. Just a slow recognition that something long ignored could no longer remain untouched. I had endured years of subtle dismissal, small remarks that chipped away at what once bound us. But what Ethan never understood was that the man he reduced to a harmless relic had already stepped aside from the version of life he assumed I lived. I built my business quietly, the way some men build fences or gardens. Steady, deliberate, without the need for audience. To Ethan, I worked at a small shop. He never asked details, never wondered why clients from multiple states called the house at odd hours. He accepted the simplest version because it suited him. In truth, the company had grown far beyond anything visible from the outside. Our safety systems were installed in warehouses across the Southeast, and contracts were handled through layered trusts and silent partnerships. Only my attorney understood the architecture fully. The anonymity was intentional. I'd always believed a simple life teaches humility better than wealth displayed. Then came the call from Creed Holloway, the CEO of Crestline Logistics, the very company Ethan praised as if it were the center of the modern world. He introduced himself with a formality I hadn't heard from my own son in years. He told me he had been reviewing supplier ownership records and discovered my trust at the top of the chain. There was a pause, the kind that suggests someone is recalibrating their assumptions. Then he asked whether the analyst working under him was truly my son. When I confirmed it, he exhaled softly, not with surprise but with understanding. "I wonder if he knows," he said. I told him he didn't. Another pause followed, longer this time, and he asked if I would permit him to acknowledge my presence at the upcoming dinner. He believed respect should be visible. I told him no recognition was necessary. Truth does not require ceremony. But he insisted that transparency mattered, and that he felt compelled to speak. After the call, I sat in my workshop, the late afternoon light slanting across the old wooden bench. Tools lay scattered from a project I wasn't fully focused on. Linda eventually stepped in, watching me with the quiet intuition only long marriages can produce. I told her a portion of the truth, not all of it, and she nodded with that steady calm of hers. "You've let him see only one half of who you are," she said. "But that doesn't erase the whole." She was right. I never tried to impress Ethan. I thought restraint would teach him to value character over display. What I hadn't considered was how easily simplicity is mistaken for insignificance by someone chasing status. He had built an image for himself in Charlotte. A world of rooftop events, expensive watches, and curated friends. In that world, a father who lived modestly was an uncomfortable reminder of beginnings he wanted to forget. As the dinner approached, I no longer felt wounded by his distance. There was instead a clarity that settled into my bones, a recognition that the problem was not what he knew about me, but what he chose not to know. He had shaped a narrative where I remained small, predictable, and easily dismissed. And yet, the truth was walking toward him in ways he could not anticipate. I didn't plan a confrontation. I didn't want one. But the balance of things was shifting, not through anger or pride, but through simple inevitability. I knew Ethan would stand in that lodge, surrounded by people he wanted to impress, believing completely in the image he crafted. And I knew that when Creed Holloway rose to speak, the room's understanding of who I was would tilt, quietly but irreversibly. I didn't need vindication. I didn't need applause. I only needed the truth to stand on its own feet. And it would. Soon enough. The lodge grew warmer as the evening gathered itself around the table. Laughter rose and settled in waves, shaped mostly by Ethan's friends, who tried to impress one another with stories polished at the edges. I sat among them quietly, watching candlelight flicker across their glasses. To them, I was background, a harmless, aging figure included out of obligation. Ethan had built that impression carefully, and the room accepted it without question. What he didn't know was that another truth was already moving in his direction, steady and unhurried. He finished his speech, the same one that carried the easy confidence of a man who believes his audience is firmly beneath him. He lifted his glass, made another joke at my expense, and waited for laughter. It came, but thinner this time, like a fabric starting to wear through. I felt nothing, no anger, no humiliation. Only a quiet recognition that the moment he believed he controlled was no longer his alone. Then Creed Holloway rose from his seat. It happened without the clatter of a fork or the hush of a sudden silence. He simply stood, composed, with the posture of a man accustomed to boardrooms where attention is earned through presence alone. Conversations tapered as people noticed him, not because he demanded it, but because authority tends to alter the air around a man. Ethan straightened in his chair, surprised but pleased. He assumed the toast would be about him. Creed lifted his glass slightly. "Before we continue," he said, "I want to acknowledge someone else at this table." A short ripple of confusion passed across the room. Ethan blinked, smile frozen, waiting for his name. But Creed's eyes settled on me. "This man," he continued, is the reason Crestline operates safely every day. His company supplies every critical component in our regional systems. Without his work, our entire logistics chain would suffer. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was absolute. A shift so complete it felt like pressure settling in the room. Some guests looked at me as though I had appeared out of nowhere. Others looked at Ethan, searching his face for acknowledgement he didn't have. I did not move. I didn't nod or smile or correct anything. I simply breathed, the same steady breath I'd held for years while letting others underestimate me. Creed went on, speaking plainly without embellishment. He described contracts, performance reliability, industry trust. Words that carried weight not because they were flattering, but because they were true. He toasted the man who built what many depend on. And he said it with a sincerity that doesn't need applause to be believed. Hands slowly lifted around the table. A few guests clapped awkwardly, unsure how to recalibrate their earlier assumptions. Natalie lowered her gaze. Ethan's expression shifted, not to pride, not to gratitude, but to something brittle, something cracking. His face lost its practiced composure, and beneath it I saw a flicker of something he had never shown me. Fear. Not fear of me, but fear of being exposed in front of his chosen audience. I did not look at him. I didn't need to. The truth was standing beside me now, no louder than before, simply undeniable. When the applause faded, the room didn't return to its earlier comfort. Conversations resumed, but changed, quieter, more careful, shaped by a newly drawn understanding. People began asking me questions, respectful ones free of condescension. They were not praising wealth. They were acknowledging reality. A reality Ethan had tried to conceal. I answered briefly, with the restraint of a man who owes nothing to spectacle. I didn't correct him, didn't highlight the irony, didn't seek repayment for years of dismissal. My dignity didn't come from the revelation. It came from my refusal to wield it as a weapon. Ethan sat stiffly, watching all of it. The laughter he once directed at me no longer found its way out of him. He lifted his glass once but didn't drink. In the space where superiority had lived, something hollow now remained. I kept my posture calm, the same measured stillness I carried when I worked through problems in silence. This was not revenge. It was simply balance restoring itself. Truth returning to its rightful place. The violinist played on, unaware that the entire tone of the evening had shifted. Candles flickered as though stirred by a breeze that had no source. Outside, the air cooled against the windows, a reminder that night always reveals what daylight tries to soften. I sat there, breathing evenly, feeling no triumph, only release. For the first time in years, I no longer felt the weight of pretending not to notice my own erasure. Ethan looked at me differently now, not with resentment or respect, but with the sudden understanding that the world was larger than he believed, and that the person he tried to reduce had never been small. Peace, when it finally arrived, did not announce itself. It simply settled into the space around me, quiet and complete.